Hey everybody. So last night was a truly sensational result for the UK Labour Party led by Jeremy Corbyn. And I think it's worth going into a few reasons why the result was so sensational. If you don't follow UK politics much, you might not be cognizant of how unfathomable this result was to the media and political class as little of time ago as a couple weeks. In March, for example, when the polls showed the Tories potentially gaining a majority that was unprecedented in the modern era, even some of Jeremy Corbyn's most stalwart supporters in the media, such as Owen Jones, who is a columnist for The Guardian and a writer on left-wing issues, called for Jeremy Corbyn to, quote, stand down as soon as possible. And Jones has sort of a complicated history with Corbyn, but the fact that he, on March 20th of this year, was calling for Corbyn to stand down because he believed Corbyn would be such an electoral liability for Labour gives you, I think, some insight into how unimaginable this prospect was for much of the political media class. And again, much of the media political class in Corbyn is kind of instinctively hostile to him anyway, but they couple that hostility with this belief that he never could possibly triumph. And I think this is worth emphasizing in just a generic sense that doesn't have anything particularly to do with UK politics, in that I think what the modern era, to get a little grandiose, is telling us is that political outcomes which at one time seemed totally far-fetched or even preposterous increasingly can become viable in a very, very short period of time. Labour's surge in the opinion polls to the point now where they almost matched the Conservative Party in terms of overall popular vote result. That happened not a very long time ago, but that trajectory only really kick-started in the past couple weeks. And I think people should be aware in general, so this doesn't apply specifically to the UK, it applies to the US. People should be aware that although naysayers who are invested in the status quo want to maintain this appearance that politics are sort of immovable and that outcomes are preordained, people should be aware that that's just been proven demonstrably false over and over again. And that doesn't necessarily always benefit the left or the right. It's sort of just a general principle that I think is increasingly applicable to politics. And we don't have to go into how that would fit the Trump example. I think that's pretty self-evident. But here are some results that I wanted to point out. For example, Labour gained a seat in the constituency of Plymouth, Sutton, and Devonport. They gained that from the Conservatives. And this is a significant result because in this particular constituency, UKIP in 2015 gained around 14% of the vote. And once Brexit was actualized, UKIP lost its sort of existential purpose, right? UKIP is this Eurosceptic party that was, headed by Nigel Farage for a long time. And their main goal in politics was to basically force a referendum on British membership in the European Union. They succeeded in doing that by having a strong showing in the 2014 European Union elections and then the 2015 UK general election, such that David Cameron in 2015 included in the Conservative Party manifesto a pledge to hold a referendum, which he actually fulfilled, and he held it, and it actually went against him because Cameron was in favor of remaining. So this constituency is in the southwest of England, and in 2015, UKIP got a very strong showing. Obviously didn't win the seat, but it got around, again, 13 or 14%. And Labour gained from 2015 to 2017 16.7%. Now that's a huge surge, whereas the Conservatives gained only 2.1%. So that it stands to reason, and this is a trend that you saw around the country, and it's not uniform, but what you can conclude from this and other results is that a significant share of the UKIP vote actually redounded to the benefit of Labour. Now that's extremely counterintuitive for people who are just immersed in the kind of orthodox media narratives. The idea that people who were Brexiteers would support the Labour candidate just seems silly. Because supposedly these Brexiteers and UKIP supporters were, ideologically right-wing, and if anything, would fall much more in line with the Conservative Party. But that was never really the case. The fact that Labour was benefited by the collapse of UKIP, meaning that a significant share of the UKIP vote was siphoned into Labour, which again is led by a true socialist in Jeremy Corbyn, that really upends many assumptions that I think people unwisely bring to the table when they're looking at politics. And again, I want to be careful about opining a little too authoritatively on the UK electoral process, given that I'm not there. I didn't speak to voters there on the ground. But there are certain things you can deduce by following the coverage and looking at the data, and that is one deduction that I think is fair. Is that this notion that UKIP voters were preternaturally conservative was never really quite right. What they were, I think, was looking for a means by which to signal their discontent with the prevailing political order, and that's what they did in, say, 2015 in the general election, and then 2016 in the Brexit referendum. But now that UKIP is no longer really a political force that has any intrinsic purpose, these people are still basically anti-establishmentarian in inclination. And Theresa May, who is the leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister, she's a avatar of the establishment. I mean, she for the first of all, she was a Remainer during the Brexit referendum. She wasn't especially vocal about it, but she was in favor of Remain. So the idea that she would be the natural go-to for the sort of disaffected UKIP voters, I think, was just an unfounded assumption. Most of the people who are a significant portion of UKIP supporters, I don't think we're ever particularly ideological. Some portion were, and those people were probably disinclined to support Corbyn. But for those of the UKIP supporters who just viewed their support as this sort of non-ideological means to an end of just kind of sticking it to the establishment, I think they might have given Corbyn a proper look, because, number one, Corbyn was relentlessly vilified by the political media establishment. And that is something that the UKIP supporters might recognize, because they too were demonized as being kind of know-nothings in supporting Brexit. And for Corbyn to have suffered a similar treatment, I think maybe engenders some sympathy, because another lesson of the modern political era is perhaps that being vilified by the political and media establishment is not a detriment but an asset. And I think Trump could probably speak to that, and even to some extent Bernie Sanders. So that, I think, made Corbyn a more viable option for these disaffected UKIP supporters than maybe a different type of Labour candidate would have been. And on top of that, Corbyn, in the referendum campaign, he was nominally for Remain, so he was something like a soft Remainer, you might say. But for his entire adult life, he was a Eurosceptic. I mean, he was against joining the. He was for the Leave, quote unquote, position when there was a similar referendum in the 1970s, when he was in his 30s. And until he seized the leadership of the Labour Party, he was viewed as part of the minority of the Labour MPs who were essentially Eurosceptical. And so, although in order to achieve sort of accord within the party, he did formally take the position of being for Remain. Basically, everybody recognized that he was personally probably for Leave, because he had a responsibility to the collective of the party, sort of modified his position. So that actually got him into a lot of trouble with other members of the Labour Party who were, cosmopolitan, very stalwartly in favor of remaining in the European Union, who felt that he did a disservice by not being more forthright in supporting Remain. And actually this led to an attempted coup on the part of the party after Brexit in June of last year, and then another leadership campaign that Corbyn won very handily. But I think what this proves is that in being sort of a soft Remainer or a kind of conflicted Eurosceptic, Corbyn actually achieved the right balance so that constituencies outside, for example, the London metropolis, which are populated by people of a Eurosceptic inclination, might view him as a viable option. So I think that, although that kind of brought him some consternation among his colleagues last year, it ended up being a politically prudent tack on his part. So I think he deserves some credit there for his strategy. And the thing is, it wasn't really a strategy in the sense that he just kind of picked whatever was most politically opportunistic. It really was it seemed to be a sincerely felt belief on his part, that although he was Eurosceptic in by nature, he had to make certain compromises as the head of a parliamentary party, and try to strike a balance, which was a very delicate task. But he seemed to accomplish it, and it redounded to his political benefit. Another interesting trend here is that, so after Brexit last year, I speculated that the power vacuum that resulted in, meaning fissures in the Conservative Party were exposed, David Cameron had to resign, the Labour Party became even more divided. My thesis was that the vacuum brought on by that event would actually strengthen Corbyn, because it made things more in flux politically. So if Corbyn has a committed core of supporters, and can bring his message to the people who are disenchanted across the board, that actually may result in Corbyn's hand being strengthened politically. And of course, if you suggested that after Brexit, you were dismissed as a lunatic. And I can speak to that from firsthand experience, because it was assumed that the triumph of Brexit would result in the flourishment of reactionary forces, when in reality, I never viewed that as necessarily likely. For one thing, UKIP, again, loses its existential reason for being, when it attained Brexit. So they no longer really become a meaningful political force. You have the Conservative Party sort of warring with itself in terms of how Brexit ought to be handled. And that created an opening or an opportunity for Corbyn. And that was demonstrated by his winning the 2016 Labour leadership election, so staving off challengers within the party and consolidating his power in the party. And then now he's led the Labour Party to its first increase in parliamentary seats since 1997. And remember, this was a guy who the media establishment declared so unfit for political leadership that he would bring about the most devastating losses for Labour potentially in its entire history. And the other elements of the party were so hostile to his rule that they attempted to effect a coup on him that failed, but showed just how deep their aversion was. So for now, for him to have led the party to have gained seats, including some seats that are that were incredibly hard to see Labour actually capturing, is a huge triumph, I think. And here's one example of such a seat. Canterbury, which has been Tory since 1918, since World War I. The constituency of Canterbury was taken by the Labour candidate by a slim margin. So not only did Labour hold most of its seats throughout the country, it made inroads into places where nobody ever thought that Labour could be competitive. And it's now to the point where Labour has gained 29 seats, and Theresa May and the Conservatives are down 13 seats. And in fact, the only reason why Theresa May is probably going to be able to form a government is because Labour surged in Scotland. I mean, they had been wiped out under Ed Miliband in 2015 in Scotland. They seem to have surged in Scotland, and that resulted in a splitting of the, you might call, progressive or left vote in Scotland between Labour and the SNP, and it allowed the Conservative Party to eke out a couple victories in Scotland, which is pretty ironic, because Scotland is historically not fertile territory for the Tories, to say the least. So that's another irony here, and I guess I'll just conclude by quoting something that I thought was really incisive that came out on June 5th by Anthony Barnett at Open Democracy, which is a political website in the UK, and he wrote the following, quote, "It is Corbyn who has captured the anti-system, anti-elitist spirit of Brexit, while the Prime Minister embodies the crepuscular condescension of the old regime. He appears to be the populist and she the hateful elitist. He is the energetic insurgent seeking change, and she is the evasive, manipulative representative of the status quo." Boom. And I think that's definitely accurate. And again, when you capture the anti-system, anti-elitist spirit of a Brexit, you're going to attract support from people who aren't necessarily in line with your ideological program, because we're in an era, I think, when people are thirsting for a way to express their anti-establishment, anti-system, anti-elitist beliefs, and this is sort of reminiscent of why, say, in the Democratic primaries of 2016, you saw Bernie Sanders do pretty well among rural white voters who aren't left-wing ideologues, but wanted an avenue through which to signal their discontent with the prevailing order. And given that Corbyn was able to capture that spirit, he broadened his support base beyond people who are philosophically left-wing. And I think that's sort of a necessary ingredient for somebody of his political disposition if they want to actually accrue power. So those are my thoughts. Interested to know what you may or may not think. And that'll do it. So have a great day.